Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Big Sci-Fi podcast, where we have really fun discussions about all things sci-fi. We are part of the Trekkies network, where you can find other really cool podcasts like the Sci-Fi Sisters. Now, this is a really special episode because it's a rare Big Sci-Fi yelling about Star Trek crossover podcast. My buddy and co-host Brian Donahue came all the way from the US to record an episode with me in my studio. The discussion is great. We talk all about our love of DS9 and its connection to our faith. Now, let's get on to it. So we are here, Canada.
We're in Canada.
In my studio.
Can you believe it?
Yeah.
I mean, you're always in Canada.
Right, I'm
not always in Canada, so this is awesome.
Yeah, exactly. I'm so glad you were able to make it today.
Thanks for having me, bro.
Yeah, no, thanks for doing this.
I'm not a big fan of traffic, especially around the Hampton area.
Yep.
It was really slow, but we made it. We had a wonderful dinner with you and Dill, my family, and so glad to be. The studio's fantastic.
Yeah.
Absolutely fantastic. You guys don't even know, those that listen to the Big Sci-Fi, how awesome Chris's studio is. This is fantastic.
Yeah, I'm glad you like it. It's just,
wonder how many times I can say fantastic as we're talking here.
Well, I mean, that's actually a great segue because we're probably out of the four hosts, probably the DS9 boys.
Yes.
And I say it's a good segue because we both think.
Excuse me, though. DS9 men.
The DS9
We're
men.
DS9 men.
Okay, true. But I say all that to say we love it.
Yeah.
We think it's fantastic. And we haven't really had like an intense, thorough discussion on DS9.
Right. It's about time.
Yeah.
Because it's our favorite, or at least one of our favorites.
Yep.
And it's so rich, it's so deep, and it's starting to have a resurgence. There's a whole new audience that's starting to see it and say, oh my gosh, this is fantastic television. Not just fantastic Trek, but fantastic television. And so it's really, I'm so happy. A whole new generation of kids are watching Deep Space Nine and enjoying it and saying, whoa, this show was ahead of its time in more ways than one. So pretty cool.
Yeah, I agree. It's so nice to see that it's getting its love and people are discovering it. And even watching it now, I feel like, obviously I'm biased, I'm a Trekkie, but I feel like you watch some TNG and, some of it holds up. Sometimes you watch a Voyager and they might hold up. But a lot of times I feel like you can see why it's dated and you're like, you get it. It's the 90s. Yeah. It was different. It was a different time, different way of doing things. But DS9 feels very, like, obviously it's not shot like a modern show, but there's a lot of elements that make it feel like it's a modern, and it fits in with this prestige era of television that we're in.
I think one of the reasons why it was not well received originally was it was just darker. It was edgier. The characters were a lot rougher around the edges. They weren't these kind of mostly crystal clean Starfleet officers, and then the guest stars would come in and add that roughness and that whatever, and then occasionally they'd have an episode where, Riker would go off the edge or something, or, whatever. But Deep Space Nine started, and it was not this happy-go-lucky place.
Yeah.
Like the Enterprise always was, where you're just like, man, I want to be on the Enterprise, Deep Space Nine was like, oh, wow, it's kind of awkward looking, and there's all these weird aliens all the time, everywhere, And so I think that's one reason why original fans were turned off of it. They wanted the cleanness of the next gen, and Deep Space Nine just didn't have that. So
yeah, that was a huge thing. I also think like one of my favorite things about it is the storylines and the fact that the episodes really build on each other and characters grow and change, which is fantastic in the era of streaming when you can say, I'm just going to binge DS9. Let me go through all the episodes.
Yeah.
But in the 90s, because I know you talked a lot about when you were watching it the first time and you would have to figure, okay, am I going to tape this? How am I going to watch it? And if you miss an episode, especially in later seasons, you were out of luck because you're like, wait, what the heck just happened? What is this? What are they talking about? I missed all these episodes.
Yep. And back then, there would be in the newspaper a nightly showing of all the TV stations, the local TV stations, and it would have a basic description of the episodes. So if I had missed an episode in its original run, whether it was Next Gen, Deep Space Nine, or even Voyager for the first few seasons, I would be looking at that in the reruns on Saturdays and see when it was running again, or the TV guide back in the day. Do they even make that anymore? I think they do.
I think they do. I feel like I've seen the TV guide like at grocery stores and like the checkout lines.
Yeah. That's where they always. I'm not noticing. I guess these days I'm looking. I'm trying to keep kids from wanting candy every time we go through the checkout line at the grocery store nowadays. But I remember having TV guides and just going. I'm watching for when the episode I missed was, and it would drive me nuts that I didn't have it, and it was just sometimes it was by luck I would record it and it would be the episode I needed. But yeah, VHS tapes, baby, VCR, standing there with the remote control, trying to stop it at the commercials so I could watch it commercial free. Drove everybody in my family absolutely bonkers though when I would get very frustrated that we weren't home on a Saturday night to record the latest episode. I would just be so grumpy. I'm sure they wanted to cast me out into outer darkness for occasionally.
That was always like, I think I was too young for that. I think I missed it in the original run because I was like, in like 2006, I think that summer I really got into DS9, and so I went really hard into it and was researching it. And I'm like, when did the last episode come out? And it was like 1998 was when the final season was.
Was it really? Wow, I haven't thought of that.
And I was in the first or second grade.
No.
And I look back and I'm like, oh my gosh, that's when it came out.
I got married in 2006.
I was doing summer school in 2006. I was like, you know what? Because I don't know if you guys have this in the U.S., but in Canada, it's like there's in grade 10, you have to take civics and careers.
Okay.
And I've always heard from everybody that's taken it that it's really mind-numbingly boring. So I was like, let me be smart. Let me take it in summer school, get it out of the way.
Gotcha.
And so that summer was it was summer school, and then after school, it was DS9.
Nice.
And it was so good. But yeah, I could go on about just my experiences watching it. But when you think about DS9, do you have like a standout character? Who's the character that you're like? And that's including not just the main cast, but also the reoccurring cast because they were so good.
Yeah. I think early on, I really just loved Cisco.
Yeah.
I loved his relationship with his son, Jake. I thought that was fantastic. I thought it was really amazing. And I loved every episode Jake was in where they interacted. I still have a good relationship with my dad. So it's like that just resonated with me. And I love that they were portraying that because they had never done that on Star Trek before.
No.
They did it poorly with Worf and Alexander, but we won't go there. Maybe we will. We'll see. Big Sci-Fi podcast fans know that that's a hot button topic with my man Chris.
And
here.
I think if you watch my channel, you'll also know I'm very even-tempered.
Right.
I try to see the positive in all of Trek.
Yeah,
but the Worf and Alexander thing just really bothered me. But to see Cisco and Jake and to see that it's not just like we're going to do maybe 2 episodes with Jake a season. But the fact that he's actually a character and he grows, he develops, and you see that bond throughout the show to the point where it's so crazy that you start off the series and Jake's just a kid. He's like 9 or 10 or something, and he's just like, hey, Dad, doing all the kid stuff. Right. And then later, he actually ends up setting him up with Cassidy Yates.
Yeah.
And he has to have the whole conversation with him. you know.
Deep Space Nine, the writers, the producers did a great job of character development. I think more so than any other Star Trek series. And you're talking to a next gen baby here. I grew, that was the Star Trek that I fell in love with Trek over, And then it was like, well, I had watched the original series, of course, in probably, their 50th rerun, whatever. Our viewers can do the math, but watching that with my dad, the Next Gen came out. I remember when the Next Generation came out. I remember watching it when it debuted and going, oh, this is really kind of interesting. And then I was there for the Best of Both Worlds Part 1, that epic cliffhanger. And I remember where I was. I was at my grandma's house. I was in one room drinking a Coca-Cola from the can and ice cold out of the fridge. My dad was in the other room on my grandpa's lazy boy chair, leaning back watching it. And then, Picard's captured by the Borg, and then Riker goes, fire, and then the screen goes black and the epic music.
Yep.
And I just remember going, no. But so I'm a next gen baby, but I would also say I'm kind of a Deep Space Nine baby too, because I watched that in its original run, and I remember sticking with it and being so frustrated when it wasn't getting the ratings that Next Gen was getting, and fans were disappointed in it. And I was like, you guys don't understand how many rich, deep characters they had right from the start to work with. And I was always an O'Brien fan, so I guess he would be another character that I really loved. I love that they portrayed him as a family man, that he really loved his wife, he really loved his daughter, and that kind of working man vibe, middle class kind of, he's the chief engineer, for crying out loud. But he kind of, for me, represented middle class, whatever in Starfleet, because he was just a guy you would want to know, you would want to be friends with. And so that would be another one, probably. O'Brien. Yeah. I loved him on Next Gen. He was a great choice to bring over to Deep Space Nine.
Yep. And it's always cool because he's enlisted, so he's full Starfleet, but he's
they
not,
talk about that.
He doesn't have the same polish, that he's not like... Yeah. Captain Picard is not someone that you would want to go out for drinks with. You trust him, but you're probably not going to invite him for a beer. But O'Brien is the guy that you would have a beer with, but you also know when he's done having his beer or whatever he's doing, he's going to go off and fix something. And basically to the point where I think they even joked that he can't he can't go on vacation, because when he does, the station just goes... Just goes crazy and no one can fix it and everything's broken. Things aren't working properly.
I loved that about Deep Space Nine when it started. It was a terrible space station for them. And Cisco was like, why am I bringing my son into this situation? And I remember just loved him wrestling with that. And I loved that things were breaking around them, that they had to fix stuff. They had to work through it. And really for me, part of that story, I guess, is... I loved the restorative aspect of that storyline, that they were working to restore something to make it better than it was ever intended to be. A space station where they brought Bajoran slaves to work and to process ore and stuff like that. Slavery happened on that station, right? Captivity. They were a conquered people, right? And now here comes Starfleet, which... especially in our day in politics, like, is it good if another nation comes in and tries to change a whole culture and get them, you know what I mean? We talk about the U.S. doing that in the Middle East a lot. Like, has it really been good that we've done those things? And that's a big debate I listen to occasionally. But I love that on Deep Space Nine. Like, they were trying. Did the Bajorans really want Starfleet there?
And even Kira mentioned, like, within the first, like, that first conversation, and she has this whole thing about Starfleet, and Cisco's like, we're trying to help. And then she's like, yes, I know you're trying to help.
Right.
And it's like, it's a very good conversation, because I think it's one of those times where I think up until maybe DS9, we've always gotten that Starfleet was perfect and there was essentially no problems in Starfleet. But then DS9 comes along, and granted, we're still seeing that Starfleet's awesome, but there's problems with it. Even Odo, who for me, Odo is probably my favorite main character of the main cast.
Okay.
I love Odo, and I love that he is very untrustworthy of the Federation. But like he has a great conversation at the very end of the series with the female changeling, and she's like, the Federation has these problems, but they're not conquerors,
Right.
so you can trust them. So
Yeah.
I like the fact that he's come around on that. But Odo, for me, is a great, just exploring the good and the bad of Starfleet and justice. This whole conversation around justice and we're using force. It's a whole. There's so many different aspects that they cover with Odo's character.
And I mean, he was so complex right away.
Right away, yeah.
Because first of all, he's a changeling, and that happened a couple times maybe in the original series. We didn't really see it. I don't believe in Next Gen. If we did, it was real quick. It was a guesting thing. Maybe they mentioned it. But here's this main character who can change shape, be anything he wants to be. Doesn't have any connection to his heritage. He has no idea where he's from, what he even is. He doesn't even know what to call himself, right? They started calling him a changeling, right? And doesn't know where his home world is, anything like that. So he's mysterious that way. But the Cardassians used him to help keep order and law in their context of slavery and bondage against the Bajorans, right?
Yeah.
So the Bajorans had this weird relationship with him.
Where they always trusted him. They always felt like,
I think he was fair.
yeah, he was fair and he would always do what was right. But then we find out later that he wasn't always perfect. And
Well, I mean, how can you be in a regime that conquers and enslaves, we hear, and here's what's interesting. I love World War II history.
Yeah.
And I love, I just watched a documentary about the Nuremberg trials, which is one of the big trials they had a couple years after the war, where they found these Nazi leaders who had committed all the atrocities and administrated things and all that stuff. And even Germans who were caught up and swept up in that war, of course, and were more or less forced to participate in the Nazi regime. You hear all kinds of stories, and I think you hear this throughout history. There are good people who are forced to do bad things or hard things or things that are kind of on the line. They're kind of grayish. You know what I mean? And so for Odo, we find out throughout this series that he wasn't quite... He had to make some tough decisions and calls, right? Mm-hmm. And maybe he didn't always make the right call, but we can be sympathetic to him because his heart was, he so sought justice. He wanted the right things to happen. And so I think the Bajorans respected that.
They respected that. Yeah. But here's the challenging thing is even when he made the right call, like even if there was a crime and he figured out who committed the crime,
right,
then that person was likely going to be executed because I don't think the Cardassians were like, oh, we'll just throw them in prison. No, we'll execute them.
Right.
And so there's always that aspect. But you're right. Like, I think that's why the Bajorans trusted him is because they knew he would try. He always strove to do the right thing.
Yeah. But he was so complex. And now he had to, now Starfleet wanted him there, or did the Bajorans say he's the security guy? I can't remember now.
I think so. Because he's Bajoran militia. So he was there, and then Starfleet kind of accepted that he was there. Like, okay, you'll be the station. And then I think in season 3, Starfleet was not necessarily happy with him, and he didn't want to follow Starfleet protocol. So then they brought in Michael Eddington as the Starfleet guy who was
Eddington,
who was going to do the Starfleet security, and
they clashed.
Yeah, and then Odo,
but then they kind of were. Eddington always tried to make Odo a friend.
Yeah, except that he betrayed everybody in the Smaki.
Great episode.
Which, like the betrayal episode, or which?
No, the episode where Eddington actually dies.
Oh yeah.
Cisco goes and hunts him down, basically.
Yeah.
Because he's about to. They have some bioweapon or something, and Cisco's trying to keep them from releasing it on this Cardassian settlement or something.
So it's like so I was rewatching that. So it's like,
were you really?
They Well, I mean, in the last year or so,
Okay,
when I
okay,
went down like the Eddington rabbit hole.
Yeah,
I was
yeah.
like, let me watch the Eddington trilogy, if you could call it that. And so in that one, it's like they get a message from Starfleet for Eddington that the cloaked missiles have launched, and so they got to go get Eddington. So I think Cisco has to go get Eddington, and it's like, all right, we're gonna go track down these missiles, blah blah blah.
Yeah.
It's all a ruse, and it was just him trying to get to his family, and then his
Yeah.
family was massacred.
Yeah.
And I think the Cisco was kind of like, oh, now I sort of feel bad. because,
It's so
Yeah.
like the best word I can think of for D Space Nine, or maybe it's 2 words. It's complicated.
it's complicated.
Like that episode was brilliant because you can sympathize with Eddington, right? He's going after a cause that he believes is just, not
Yeah.
evil, but that he believes is just, that is right. Cisco is serving a cause that he believes is just and right. Okay?
Yeah.
And he's ticked off that Eddington tricked him and betrayed him. So Cisco is, again, not very Starfleet like, at least
Nah.
Gene Roddenberry's interpretation of what a Starfleet
Not
officer
in that
should be.
situation, because like this is where, and I love Cisco.
Yeah.
He's up there. He's an all time great, of course.
Yeah.
But I really I can't deal. I have a hard time with the episode where he's trying to hunt him down.
Yeah.
Because he ends up poisoning 2 planets, or poisoning a planet just to get Eddington, who's a Maquis, who's a bad guy. But what's
Yeah.
hard for me is I also love
I
Voyager.
forgot about that.
Yeah. So like that's a problem. And then I'm also I love Voyager.
Yeah.
And I'm like, but the Maquis aren't that bad. Like Cisco, just watch Voyager. Look at Chakotay. Look at all them. They're all doing. Of course, he's not aware that Janeway and them are working together.
Yeah.
But it's like it's hard for me to feel his hatred towards the Maquis because he was like,
Cisco's hatred towards the Maquis.
yeah,
Okay.
Cisco's hatred. I just felt like I can see being a little peeved.
Right.
He's like, I even took him to a baseball game. I'm like, oh, he took him to a baseball game.
So really, I think was Cisco frustrated with the Maquis as much as he was Eddington, or was it really more Eddington and he was kind of frustrated that the Maquis were just stirring up trouble for him? That's kind of how I remembered it.
Yeah,
was,
that's a good question because they deal like in the episode, I think season 2, where they introduced the Maquis. There's like his one buddy from the academy who's also a captain.
yeah,
And they're like really good friends and blah blah blah, and they're working together to try and bust the Maquis. But then at the end of the episode, that captain's like, "I'm Maquis," and Cisco is upset, but he's not. He's more upset with Eddington, a guy that he didn't know from Adam or whatever you
Right.
want to say. More upset that he was tricked by him than than one of his best buddies from the academy.
yeah.
So that always struck me as odd.
That is odd, but I wonder too if that's just like the progression of the writing from the writers.
Yeah.
Like they were trying to flesh out who Cisco was in the first 2 seasons, I think. And then it wasn't really until the 3rd and 4th seasons that we really start to see Cisco truly come into himself. Like, I think that's around the time they finally let him shave his head. And then he did the
Yeah.
goatee thing,
Yeah. Season
which I
4.
just love that. And so I feel like part of that we can say is just the writers trying to flesh out. And then as they get to Eddington, they're like, this is more complicated situation. And Cisco's got different layers like an onion or a parfait, Shrek reference there, So I thought that was fascinating. So I just have to say too, like, and we can get into this a little bit later more, but the thing about D Space Nine is D Space Nine went into the faith
Yeah.
route. They are spirituality much more than all the other series combined, even to this day.
Even to this day, there's nothing that compares to how DS9 dealt with faith.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is so fascinating. And I remember early on I don't know how old I was. I'm not even going to try to waste brain cells remembering how old I was when it first came on. But I remember being so fascinated by it. And even though it was, this Bajoran faith in particular is what it's centered around, right? The prophets, and the wormhole aliens and them being prophets and all this stuff, and then eventually Cisco becoming a prophet,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Which was, it worked.
Well, so here,
Okay, let's get
yeah,
into
because
it.
I was never bothered by that. So I
Right,
actually
right.
want to go a whole different angle. But first, I feel like
Okay.
let's touch on him becoming a prophet, because never bothered me. I always thought that was a good choice. He didn't he's going to come back eventually. Made sense. My wife Dill hates Cisco with a passion because she does not really agree with the fact that he had Jake was fully grown, so that's a bit more acceptable. But she was really kind of bothered by the fact that just when the new kid was born, he left and became a prophet. And it's so funny that she said that, because I remember watching behind the scenes, and I think Avery Brooks, I think they were going to try and kill him off or something, or something like
Wow.
that. And he said, "I do not want to be another black father that gets killed and ditches his kid." So that was the solution.
Wow.
But in the same time, he still left his kid, even though, granted, it was a greater purpose than
Yeah,
necessarily how we might define it. And he was going to come back at some point,
Yeah.
which he does in the books. He comes back and
Sure.
and does all that stuff. But so yeah.
That's interesting.
Dill always had kind of an issue, or has an issue with that, and I sort of see that, because it's like, yeah, now Cassidy Yates is basically stuck raising this kid on her own, and she wasn't planning to be a single mother. Like, that was
Right.
not, like, there was always the consideration that he would die, and if that happened, he's a Starfleet officer, they're fighting
Yeah.
a war, but I don't think she was ever considered, "Oh, I wonder if he might become a prophet," even though she knows that he is the emissary.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of pastors' wives, my wife included,
Yeah.
who they married us, and I didn't think I'd marry a pastor, It's not quite the same thing.
Not quite the same thing.
I'm never just gonna go off and live somewhere else.
Yeah.
As a spiritual being without my wife. You know what I mean? I'm not gonna choose to do that. And so it's different, but I think that's probably where I do have a problem with the character.
Yeah.
Is that I was okay with him being this prophet to the Bajorans, and he was kind of a reluctant prophet.
Yeah, especially at
He
the beginning.
didn't fully embrace it at the beginning. Now, as the series went on, he certainly did. Or maybe he just came to terms with it. He accepted
So-
it. It is what it is. So I
There-
might as well. You know what I mean?
There was one, it was such a great episode, and I love the way it was sort of the prophets testing him, where I think for whatever reason, something happens in the wormhole, and they discover that there's this other emissary guy who was stuck
Yes.
in the,
Okay.
he was stuck in
I'm
the wormhole.
tracking with you, yep.
Yeah, so he comes out of the wormhole, he's from 300 years in the past or something, and then he's the true emissary.
Yeah.
And so Cisco's like, "Oh, thank goodness, I don't have to be emissary anymore." The guy becomes emissary, starts
Yeah.
doing a bunch of stuff that Cisco doesn't like, and then that's the thing that pushes him over the edge to be like, "You know what? I want to fully embrace being an emissary."
Yeah.
And then so when he gets to that point and he becomes the emissary, from that point forward, he is fully committed.
Yeah.
So I'm always curious, because you bring up being a pastor, and I've
Mm-hmm.
always wanted to talk to a pastor, especially one who's a Trekkie,
Mm-hmm.
about DS9 and your perspective of the series
Yeah.
from a person who is of faith.
Yeah. Well, I remember as I was a teenager somewhere, older teenager probably, watching Deep Space Nine and being very zealous back in the day, very passionate about my faith, in particular about Jesus as a evangelical Christian. Being like, oh my gosh, here's another show that's representing faith in this weird way, kind of had this stereotypical New Age. We were always afraid of New Age things in my faith growing up. Like, oh man, that's New Age. Be careful. Watch out. It's not Jesus, right? So watching Deep Space Nine originally, I was like, oh man, why are they doing this? But as I got a little bit older and as the show went on, I was like, I started to get it. Like, hey, they're not just they're not trying to write something in a way that is to dog any religion or make fun of any faith. It was very serious how they talked about faith on the show. The Bajorans were serious about their faith, man. Like, you know what I mean? And you saw Cisco go through this kind of journey of going, I don't know about that, to actually embracing it as a part of their culture and eventually his culture and his mindset. And so I think the writers weren't trying to point out any religion. They were just saying, we need to incorporate this because this is a major part of a lot of people's lives. Whatever they worship, whatever their faith is, a lot of our people who watch this have some sort of faith in some God or something bigger than themselves. And so I kind of chilled out a little bit through the years about it. Like, you know what? That's pretty cool they did that. Because I think we can all see a little bit of who we are in the discussions they have. You know, we see persecution for faith in the show from time to time. We see that lived out mostly through the Cardassian occupation, you know.
Yeah, so it's interesting because you're talking about like how DS9 is able to represent people in different aspects of their faith.
Yeah.
And for me, I feel like where I'm at with my faith is I'm at Cisco season 1 level where I'm accepting of it, but I'm still uncomfortable with it.
Yeah.
Because, you know, my family's very religious and obviously my wife is very religious because of that. So I really want to try and embrace it. But I feel like, okay, I'm at Cisco season 1. I'm accepting of it, but I'm not fully embracing it. And I want to get to like season 6 and season 7
Right.
Cisco, where I'm like fully invested and fully, you know,
I get
truly,
it. Yeah.
truly believe that.
Yeah. Well, I think the thing I always say as a pastor to people is embrace the journey. And I believe that God is very patient with people. And that it's okay to take your time. It's okay to research and think and read and ponder and maybe pray and think and go through the process. It's okay to experiment. It's okay to, you know, go deeper, whatever that is, and to see what happens. And to take it step by step. Don't be afraid of baby steps. I mean, that's what we see Cisco go through.
Yeah.
Is really baby step after baby step after baby step. And then oftentimes, like for many people, there are these revelation moments or these experiential moments where something happens and it does something to us to where we either go deeper, way deeper, and we say, okay, yeah, I believe in God, or what, you know, whichever faith you're a part of. I think there's moments where we go and say, wow, okay, I get it now. But embrace the journey, just like Cisco did. You know, even unintentionally, he was kind of brought into this against his will in some ways.
Like in the first episode, he goes down to Bajor because he's like, oh, let me go meet with Kayapaka. You know, she's like their religious leader. Let me try and make a connection with her so we can really get the, I'm trying to think of the word, not the restoration, maybe that's the right word, the restoration of Bajor going. He's like, I got to connect with them. That's part of my job. And he goes there thinking he's basically going to have a business meeting. Like, okay, let's talk about what we need. But then she's like, you're the Cisco, and she feels his ear and, you know, feels his paw and says it's strong and then says you are the Cisco, you're the emissary, you've got to do this great thing. And he doesn't believe it. And then he succeeds. Yeah. And then then after that, it's like, he's still kind of getting his feet wet and really taking those baby steps.
I love that, Chris, because that is a lot of people's real life, non-science fiction, nonfiction, you know, real life experience with faith and religion. And is that sometimes we can have something happen or we interact with somebody and we feel different. We're like, whoa, what was that? Or that was kind of strange, you know? And it's okay. Like, I think sometimes I don't know how it is in the Canadian culture. In the American culture, we can sometimes avoid being uncomfortable at all costs.
Right. I think, no, we can do that too.
We avoid pain.
Yeah.
If we have any type of pain, we want to pop a pill. We want to drink something. We want to turn on the television to ease the pain. You know what I mean? And so I think that we have to be okay living in uncomfortable from time to time, at least. And that's what faith is time to time. It's not knowing how something is going to turn out, but believing that the best could and can and maybe even will happen ultimately. If it's not going to happen today or tomorrow, we believe that the best is going to happen later on, and it's worth putting up with these harder circumstances. It's worth going through something hard to believe that we're learning something. So faith doesn't just have to be about religion or God. We can just have faith that, hey, if I persevere and endure, ultimately this is going to turn around, and ultimately I'm going to be okay. Now, we put that faith towards God. Christians do, Muslims do, Hindus, many religions do. We trust that God, in the end, will be okay, right? And so we see that beautifully, I think, in Deep Space Nine. The Bajorans have to endure being conquered.
Yeah, and it's like, what, 50 years or something?
Oh my gosh, yeah, they have to endure being slaves. They have to endure not being able to worship like they really want to, right? Families are torn apart from each other, but their faith is what really gets them through the Cardassian occupation.
Yeah.
It's not just fighting back. It's not just, hey, we want to have our world back. It's their faith that there's something out there, the prophets, the emissary has been prophesied about, and the emissary is going to help bring us out of this slavery, out of this as a conquered people. So that's huge. And there's biblical, like now I look back on that and I go, there's biblical, like this is a modern day, like Moses.
Right, yeah.
The Israelites were in slavery in Egypt. And here comes Moses out of the desert in his 40s, no, 80s, because he was born into Egyptian slavery, right? He became basically a prince of Egypt, and then he was cast out. He ran away because he killed an Egyptian slaver who was beating an Israelite. He had discovered his true Israelite heritage, and he became enraged at this Egyptian that was beating a slave, killed that Egyptian, buried him in the sand, and took off into the desert and started herding sheep, basically. Okay? He was in the desert for 40 years. It wasn't until he was around 80 that he had the burning bush experience, and then went back, and he was very hesitant. He was like anybody but me. We know Moses had a stutter. He had a speech impediment, and that's why Aaron had to go with him to actually talk to the king of Egypt. And it was so for me, I see in that story now of this emissary in Deep Space Nine, Captain Sisko, or at the time Commander Sisko,
Commander Sisko,
coming into this situation, and hey, he's really kind of this Moses figure in Deep Space Nine for the Bajorans. He's the guy that's going to come, and even though, they kick the Cardassians out, the Bajorans
they did it all by themselves.
Yeah,
like
here comes Sisko, and he's got a way out of Egypt, though. And no offense to Egypt. Egypt's a beautiful land, beautiful people. Just referring to the biblical reference.
At that time, yeah.
It's only been in the last few years where I go, wait a minute. Wow, he was a Moses in this story. I can connect that in my faith to watching Star Trek. And that's pretty cool. Another faiths probably have other different ways of viewing Sisko in other figures in their religion too. So I just, again, as a pastor, I'm going, hey, yeah, it looks different than Christianity, but at least they're talking about religion. At least they're talking about faith. and it's opening the door to deeper conversations, and it made Deep Space Nine. I think the whole faith storyline sets Deep Space Nine apart from all the other Trek series, even to this day. Am I giving you what you were hoping for?
Yeah.
Okay.
I want to continue this because,
Cool.
I think that's an interesting way of looking at it, and like the Moses connection.
Yeah.
For me, being someone who wasn't really a faith and now sort of opening that door and exploring that journey, one thing that I loved is the fact that you can have two characters, and this is like Kira and Dax. You have Kira who's all about faith, you have Dax who's all about science, and the two are able to interact and get along.
They're best friends.
They're best friends.
Yeah.
And there's like a lot of times where what I really appreciate, especially like in this journey, is like when people don't necessarily say you have to become a person of faith, you have to go to church, but when they take the Kira approach and say, hey, look, like if you ever want to learn about my faith or learn about our faith, you know, come to a service with me, come to the temple, come to the Bajoran temple with me, and we can do that. And so I really appreciate the fact that they're able to have those conversations, and we even get into the which is I can't think of. The Stopes trial, like obviously I don't want to get into the whole like is evolution real, is it not, that whole thing, but I like the idea that there was conflict from the Bajorans who were like, you can't teach that the prophets are just aliens in the wormhole, just wormhole aliens.
Oh my gosh, I had thought of that for a long time.
And so I love the fact that you had these two different viewpoints, and granted Kai Wynn, who was there, I think at the time she was just a Vedic. But
Kai Wynn.
Yeah, and she was the most extreme, like you have to teach it my way or the highway. But I like the fact that DS9 was like, let's have that discussion. Let's see if we can find a way of getting these two different worldviews working together. Because I think Star Trek, up until that point and probably afterwards, has taken the approach beyond maybe... I know there was a couple of times where they mentioned God in the original series. And they mentioned, of course, Star Trek 5, they try to find God. But I always felt like Star Trek was very critical of religion, and always says, you know, you shouldn't be religious. And I even seem to remember Picard at some point saying, like an ancient, or saying something negative about religion, where it was a nice change to see that you could have secular views, but also views of faith coexisting on DS9, and just of them being able to work through that, and not like, because at schools, like, you know, obviously a lot of times we take this approach, you know, let's not talk about religion at work, let's not mention that, and I understand that, but it wasn't like they were avoiding the subject, they're just like, let's have those open and honest conversations around it, in a way that you can't necessarily have with TNG, with the exception of Worf. Who, he is, I would say, of that cast, he is the religious character, or the one that...
Klingons are very religious. And I mean, you know, it's...
Not in the way that they believe in God, because, like, all the gods were killed by...
They revere Kahless, you know, and the first two Klingons that fought forever, and then Kahless won, or whatever, you know, like, they have their version of that. They have meditation. Remember Worf needing to go off and meditate? I can't remember the episode, but anyways, you know, they kind of introduced that to a degree, but I think, Chris, most people of faith, and I know, and I can't speak for any other people than my own, but most Christians that I know that love people, that want to be kind, that want to serve and help others, that have a love for creation and the world around them and the planet and all that stuff, genuinely want to live in peace, and they're not weird about their faith. You know what I mean? Like, like they can go to work, they can interact with their coworkers, and the coworkers that want to interact with them about faith, whichever faith it is, they can do so naturally because it's truly a part of who they are. And they're not pushy with it. They're not weird with it. They're not super radical with it. They might have a zeal. They believe what they believe, which I think is important too. But they don't put other people down. And they have friends. There's all types of Christians I know that have friends that aren't Christians, that are in science, in that industry, that are businessmen and women that are, named the vocation and whatever, and they're good friends with people. And that's what we see portrayed in Kira and Dax. Is they become best friends as time goes on, right? And they have great conversations. Kira goes to the temple occasionally with, or Dax goes to the temple occasionally with Kira, but they had to learn that though. And the more they became friends, they began to appreciate everything about each other, and so they could talk about stuff. And I think that sometimes in the religious world, we Christians in particular, unfortunately, get labeled as anti-science. I love Kira and Dax because they are best friends and they can talk about anything, and they do. And they have each other's backs, and Dax is the science-y, right? Kira is the religious, and it works. Yeah. And I think it works, Chris, because number one, Kira has learned how to chill a little bit about her faith. Right? I think she's not weird with it. I think she knows when to pull it out and use it more effectively than she did it when the series started. When we first met her, she was just hot off the occupation and the rebellion and the resistance and fighting and losing so many friends and just hot about that and just upset and emotional and said whatever came out of her mouth, right? Just said, I've earned the right to say whatever I want to whoever I want to, right? And we loved it because also it was a different type of female character for television. Strong, a woman of authority and power, of dignity, saying what's on her mind and not caring. That was radical for television.
Like as a character,
at the time.
like she was, I think like even Nana Vister has said that, or is it Vister? Visitor.
Yeah.
I think is how she pronounces it. Said that she wasn't written like a woman. Like that character was not written like a woman in the 90s. Mm-hmm. It was written just like an actual person who was allowed to disagree and to get into arguments and to be vocal about her feelings in a way that we had not seen in TV. Mm-hmm. You have not seen in Star Trek before. And I don't say I always joke about this, but like there's been some times on my or my YouTube channel where I've compared, I even did a podcast episode where I compared Seinfeld characters to Trek characters. Right. Mm-hmm. And it's funny, the only other woman that I can think of, especially of television of the 90s, someone who was as aggressive and aggressive in the sense that she will stand up for what she believes in. Right. Not like in a mean way, but in like, you know what? I have feelings too. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to be dismissed. I'm not going to be treated badly. The only other character that I can think of that ever matches her level of outspokenness is Elaine from Seinfeld. Yeah. Except for Elaine's, she's just argumentative and it's always a selfish goal for her. Yeah. Like it's how can she get something out of it? Whereas like Kira's thing is more about her people and fighting for her people. Yeah. But it's just so fascinating that you can get a character like Major Kira. Who, doesn't you really? I'm sure we've seen people like her since then, but very much at the time she was revolutionary. Yeah, I would even say, I don't know if there's been a better case of a female character on a show, a main character that was as strong as she was from the start. Yeah. I think that there are plenty of characters on television where they kind of grow into that more, and it's awesome, and it's a great journey, but I think that the writers were just so far ahead of their game. And the thing that I work with females, you do as well, but one of the terms that's used so often when we talk about females or women in ministry, because there are some groups of religions that do not want women in high positions at all. Okay, there's a very much a gap there, and for various different reasons.
I happen to be a part of a tradition now that says women can go as high as far as they want to. And I'm very proud of that. But there's a term that they use, and Adina's used it on the Big Sci-Fi podcast, I think, that Kira wasn't in like this kind of caretaker caregiver role, that like, even though Dr. Crusher was a strong woman,
she's still a mother.
and she would tell Picard what she thought.
Yep.
And Picard would listen and respected that. She still was a doctor. She was someone we associate as sometimes woman. She has the capability, compassion, and caring and sensitivity. She was in a motherly role with Wesley Crusher. So it's not quite the same. Kira was in command, right? She was a warrior.
Yeah, she's probably, I would say for me, looking at Kira, I could see if she's in a fight, I can't see her losing that fight.
Right.
Like she's just someone that is so strong, even if she went up against like a war for, I'm just trying to think of who the best fighters are in the series. But like, yeah, she's portrayed differently in the way that I'm sure Dr. Crusher could handle herself if she needed to.
Which she sure did in Picard.
Oh, she sure did in Picard. I mean, we see her take command of the Enterprise in DNG.
Right.
Did a great job on
Very
that.
true.
But these were kind of event moments in the series, whereas Kira just naturally
From the start.
because she's the first officer character.
Yep.
And she kicks butt. She kicks all kinds of butt.
Right.
And is even like one of my favorite storylines of DS9 is we hear all about Kira being a guerrilla fighter and a freedom fighter, and we don't get to see that. And we get to hear, and she, her distaste for the Cardassians, we hear about that all the time. But then in season 7, when we find out that Damar has gone rogue and has had enough with the Dominion, and is going to go be his own rebel fighter, and then it's like, okay, well, they need help. Kira, you got to go do that. Yeah. And so that storyline of seeing Kira working with Damar,
so good. Not just dramatically, but like it was so good and such a nice twist for Deep Space Nine that we see Kira overcome her racism, her hate, her bigotry, her hatred. I mean, if anybody had reason to, right? I mean, she was a slave.
Yeah, she was
was mistreated.
Yeah.
And so she has all that in her, but I love that in that season that comes back around. And honestly, Chris, I think part of that is not just because it's an interesting storyline. I think it makes sense with her own faith journey.
Yeah.
That this is who she actually is, and that she needs to help now, even though the Cardassians beat her, enslaved her, conquered her, starved her, raped her. It's an amazing testament to her faith that she is able to overcome all of that and help now this other uprising, this other people now that are being oppressed. Finally, they thought they were going to be conquerors with the Dominion, but then they ended up becoming. Damar started saying, "Hey, wait a minute, our freedoms are going away piece by piece here. We're not going to be conquering hero. We're slaves." Just like and he is kind of like something switched in him.
Yeah.
And it was beautiful. But for Kira, I believe if it wasn't for her faith, and I don't recall if they explored this in those episodes.
Like if it was her faith?
I don't think they did.
No, I don't think so.
But I look at it as a pastor and as a Christian going, whoa, I don't think she does that unless her faith says, this is how I now need to love my enemies. Right?
Yeah.
Because the true measure of love, this is something, one of the most radical things ever, in my opinion, ever written down on paper, is that no greater love hath a man than this, and he laid down his life for a friend. But what we're supposed to believe as Christians is not just that. Like, Chris, I would lay down my life for you because you're my friend. If a bus was coming at you, man, and you didn't see it, your back was turned, and it was all I could do to run out there and push you out of the way, and then I take the hit and die, I would do that. You're my friend, right? I would do that for my wife, my kids. You would do it for your wife.
Yeah, do it for my wife.
Right?
I hope I would be able to push you back and say,
Right.
no, Brian, you have a family you got to deal with.
Right.
You know,
But
you take care of,
I
not deal
appreciate
with.
that, man.
You know?
Oh, it's so lovely right now. It's so wonderful. But you know what I'm saying? We're supposed to love our family that
Our lover,
way.
yeah, exactly.
We're supposed to lay down our lives for each other. But what Jesus taught was that we actually should do that for our enemies too. Right? Now that's when it becomes a little harder.
Yeah,
When it's
much
for
harder.
some, or even just take the harshness of enemy away, someone we don't know. Or someone like Damar who abused Bajorans and laughed and loved it.
And abused Kira, like on the station
Yes. Yeah.
when they took over.
Exactly.
briefly.
Oh my
Yeah.
gosh. Yeah. So powerful. She doesn't come to that conclusion or to that ability to say, yes, I'm going to help you, unless she's got deep faith involved in that. So that's pretty powerful.
Yeah, that's so powerful. And the fact that it's her emissary, too, telling her to do this, not just her captain, but her
Yeah.
emissary. And there's a scene, and I don't know if this is like, if there's any faith involved, but like one of my favorite scenes in that storyline at the beginning, and I don't remember how far it is into their rebellion, but when they're on a runabout and they're coming back, and Damar's like, hey, they just killed my wife and my kids, and they had nothing to do with it. And Wei Yun knows they had nothing to do with the rebellion. And Kira, out of pure anger for a minute, is like, yeah, what kind of people, Damar? Totally going like, you did this to me, you
Right.
did this, you did this to us. And then she immediately regrets it and is like, oh, you know what, that wasn't, I should not have said that. And so I appreciate she's able to say it. And Garrick is there who's like, no, he needed to hear that because he needed to know that it's just not you can't romanticize freedom fighting.
Yep.
And he needed to hear that from you.
Yeah.
But I appreciated that Kira was able to like, because I don't know if season one Kira, for one thing, she wouldn't have been able to do that. But if she did, she would not have immediately felt horrible
Yeah.
because she's able to like, even though Damar is her enemy, she's like, but that's still his kid, still his wife.
I think even good people, and even take faith out of it, but especially with faith, people of faith in particular, but even without, have moments where we've had all this growth, but maybe we've had a traumatic experience in our past, and for some reason we're reminded of it, or we see somebody or whatever, and that trauma comes back up, and our response is to hate again. Our response is to react viscerally, because sometimes we're thrown off by it, we're surprised by it. So even good people can take 10 steps forward in a positive way, but occasionally have to take 2 or 3 back because they allow hatred, they allow that anger, that hurt to come forward again for whatever it is. And so I think, like, I love in these moments like this on Deep Space Nine that they show the reality of what the human experience is. Even though we're talking about aliens here and in a Bajoran Kira and a Cardassian Damar, it's the human experience of what growth actually looks like. And people of faith, and for me as a Christian, there are times when I feel like, man, I'm hitting it. I'm doing good. I'm loving my neighbors well. I'm loving my family well. I'm thinking about others more than myself. Like I'm putting the needs of others first. I'm not just thinking selfishly about what I want or I desire or I need, But then I go through periods where I'm like, I'm the most selfish person I know, And I have to be okay with that in the sense that I believe in this thing called grace. And every single human being, I hope on earth, believes in grace and wants grace and knows that they need grace, right? It's like any relationship, especially marriage. I love my wife more than anybody else on earth, but I can also offend her better than anyone else on earth. You know what I'm saying, brother?
Right. I am now learning.
I know
it's
the
like,
buttons.
My wife and I, we know the buttons. We love each other dearly.
Yep. But sometimes
we know the buttons.
And so what do you need in that instance? Grace.
Yes.
You need your wife to say, you know what, Chris, you were just a jerk to me, but I still love you and I'm going to choose to forgive you. And that's what Kira does. In that moment, she chooses to finally, once and for all, forgive not just Damar, but all of Cardassia for what they did. Because that's what she needs to move on, to be happy. She needs to forgive. Sometimes forgiveness is a choice, not a feeling. And forgiveness is actually more powerful to us rather than the person that needs forgiven.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
And so I think we see throughout the series Kira with all this distrust, racism. I mean, it was earned from her
it was
point
earned,
of view. You know what I mean?
It was very well earned. But
I think in the end, she goes, "Wait a minute, who am I really? Who do I really want to be?" And I think she chooses very wisely. And I just love the journey, though. They didn't just all of a sudden Kira gets everything and is perfect. She had that moment.
Yeah.
Yeah, Damar. What's that feel like?
What's that feel like? And then she's like, oh,
yeah.
I shouldn't have said that like immediately. And it's like, I feel like if we, and this is going back to why we love DS9.
Yeah.
But if she had been a character in TNG, I feel like, with the exception of Worf's always kind of the interesting one who doesn't fully ever get over his racism, and definitely not in TNG.
Yeah.
But I still feel like if we had a Kira-like character in TNG, she would just, especially if she was the main character, she would get over it much faster. And
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I was going to say that, in TNG, I feel like they would just wrap up that storyline pretty easily, or they wouldn't really explore it. And because you're about to say Worf, I only bring that up because there's an episode of TNG, trying to remember what season, if it's season 2 or season 3, but they're dealing with a Romulan guy who needs a blood transfusion.
Yes.
And only Worf can give him that blood because of whatever sciencey stuff.
Was it called The Defector?
That's that episode. The Defector? Maybe that's the episode. I got to check mine because that's the one where they deal with a Romulan guy who's like, I want to defect. They're building all these bases. They're doing all this crazy stuff. But then it turns out the joke, but like it was all a ploy just to see if this guy would really turn.
Yes.
And so maybe it's that episode. But like I always thought that in TNG, the TNG ending would have been Worf overcomes his racism and his beliefs and gives the blood transfusion.
In the last 5 minutes of the show.
But then he says no, he doesn't do it. And so the Romulan guy dies. And Worf could have saved him. Yeah. So I feel like with that exception, TNG would always take the happy-go-lucky approach. Mm-hmm. And so you'd have Kira on TNG, and she would be a lot more, or forgive Cardassians a lot faster. Mm-hmm. But with DS9, we get that slow burn. We get to see her journey. We get to see her faith. And her come to that ultimate, you know what, I've forgiven you, and I've forgiven Cardassia as a people.
Right. Well, I think
their sins.
I'm glad you bring up Worf again, because Worf on Deep Space Nine was always the roughest character, in my opinion. He was the one where you just kind of the most often went, Worf, you know? Okay. But I think that it was, some of it was comic relief, honestly. Some of it was trying to make his culture different, because he was always struggling between what it was to be a Klingon, but living in a very much human Starfleet world, growing up with human parents. And but he was kind of the roughest, because he had this heritage that even in Next Gen, they didn't fully understand the Klingons.
Yeah.
You know? And we see that through the Officer Exchange program episode where Riker goes to a Klingon ship, right? Yeah. And then Duras comes, or not Duras, Worf's brother, we Kern. Eventually find out Kern comes aboard the Enterprise to take Commander Riker's spot for a while. And so we learn they still don't really fully understand the Klingons. Worf doesn't even fully understand his heritage at this point, if I recall. And so it was this, Worf was this rough thing. That was their version of somebody who would make mistakes. Now, I guess I say that. It's not that the characters never made mistakes, but I think Worf was just kind of an easy go-to.
Yeah, so Worf is an interesting thing where I felt like, yes, on TNG, Worf was gruff. He was he was the different one. He was the one that made mistakes. But I still felt like he was pretty tame as a character.
Yeah.
'Cause-
Oh, he was. Yeah.
But then I felt like when he went on to DS9, they're like, let Worf be Worf. And then we get to see his more gruffness. The fact that he's, getting into more conflict. Like I always got the sense in TNG, by the end of the series, he's supposed to respect everybody. Like he respects Dr. Crusher a lot. He probably trusts her with his
Right.
life. He probably feels that way about everybody on
sure.
TNG.
Yeah.
But on DS9, he didn't. He was allowed to not like people. He was allowed to only tolerate and just barely tolerate Bashir.
Right.
He didn't have to become best friends with him. He didn't have to become best friends with Odo.
Yeah.
And so they allowed him to be more gruff.
But still, though, there was, in the end, a type of a general respect.
Oh, for sure.
I
For
think
everybody.
as the series progressed, in particular, there was a general, even in that instance between Worf and Bashir, they began to respect each other as colleagues.
Yeah,
But it took a while.
See,
it wasn't right away.
It's interesting because going back and watching it, I felt like at the beginning, like when Worf and Bashir are in that prison camp, there's a lot more respect between them. And then,
Right.
like, he gets invited to the bachelor party, or not the bachelor party, but like a bachelor party, but that's actually really
Right.
miserable for
Yeah.
Bash and O'Brien. Which always, and I want to do a whole video or rant about that. The fact that I just feel like out of all the people he picked, why did he invite Bash
Right.
to the party? Just because it's like, well, they don't really connect, but there was a bit of a respect there.
Yeah.
But then I feel like, and I don't know if it's just because of his relationship with Dax, and then her going from Jadzia to becoming, and then introducing us to Ezri, that he really did not like Bashir.
Yeah.
That's always been my impression. I could be wrong.
Yeah.
But I did love the fact that they were able to not become best friends. And even him and Odo, I feel like they connect every once in a while, but they butt heads a lot
Yeah.
in a way that we could never see on TNG.
Yeah.
I don't even know how we even got up to
I don't,
got on
well,
to
well, I
Worf.
tell you, we can maybe bring it back around this way is
Yeah.
that for my faith, being a Christian, we really believe in the concept of treating people with respect. And that may not get lived out on social media all the time, unfortunately.
By both sides.
There
by
are people,
Christians and non-Christians.
yeah, there are people who say dumb things. Just like any person of any faith or any whatever, people say dumb things and do hurtful things and have really mean hearts and spirits about themselves. But what we really believe is that we should be able to work with anybody. We should be able to love people enough to respect them and to have their best interest at heart. And that means that it doesn't mean we have to be best friends with everybody. Like Worf and Bashir were not best friends by any stretch of the
no.
imagination, but they figured out how to work with each
and they
other.
respected each other. And I think, you can.
And that's really important. Again, for me, that comes from a place of faith. That comes from my relationship with God and what I believe the Bible says, how I should treat people and respect people and honor people, regardless of what they look like, regardless of the color of their skin, regardless of their religion, regardless of what they believe. I need to treat people that way because that's how I want to be treated. And so that's just really, really important, I think, for us to keep in mind, you know?
But yeah, so we're back now after some like technical issues with batteries, but we're back. But yeah, I feel like we covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, this is good, man. This is really good. We have gone where the big sci-fi and perhaps yelling about Star Trek has never gone before.
Has never gone before. We got to say it.
Got to
like-
do the Riker or the
Yeah.
Picard maneuver.
And I don't know if you realize this, but legally we have to make a reference to never gone before, or where no
Yes.
one has gone before because, well, it's Star Trek. But this is the first time that we've ever done the Big Sci-Fi podcast I guess in person, not a convention.
Right,
And this is
right.
definitely the first time I've done a yelling about Star Trek podcast, even though I'm not going to necessarily call it that in person and in real life. That's not a convention.
Yeah, nice. Well, this is fun. You got a great studio, man. This is a fantastic setup. So
Thank
maybe
you.
this won't be the last time I'm in this room. Maybe sometime you'll come to Ohio and be in my little studio, although it doesn't look quite as modern and hip and yuppie as yours does. Yuppie's a good thing.
Yuppie's
using
a good thing.
Okay.
Okay.
Just so everybody knows.
Yeah, just so we
if
know.
you're a yuppie, no offense, all right? But anyways, this has been fun, man. And I
Yeah.
love talking about faith with you and Deep Space Nine and just fun. Just fun.
Yeah, this has been really, really good.
Feel like our ending though is not as strong as
It's not as strong as
our
we would have
discussion
liked.
has been.
Do
but-
we just keep going until we come
Yes,
up with a good
yeah,
ending?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, but honestly, Brian, it's been a lot of fun to have you here.
Thanks, brother.
And
Thank
I
you.
definitely can't wait to do it again.
Oh, we should do it again. Absolutely. And for all of you Big Sci-Fi podcast fans and yelling about Star Trek fans, hopefully we have fans. I think we do.
I think we do.
I think we've got listeners and viewers in both camps. Just get along, be kind, be nice to each other, respect each other. Come on, it's life. We're all humankind, right? So let's get along. Let's work together for a better future. Amen.
Amen.
I dig it.